She tried it once. Gently. The way a person tries something they already know isn't going to work. The way someone tests a door they've already been told is closed. She pulled the key out, looked at it. The same silver key she had carried for 11 years, the one with the small chip along the ridge that she had always meant to replace. And she turned it over in her fingers. Then she looked at the door. The door was the same, glossy black, freshly painted, the kind of black that absorbs light instead of reflecting it. Number 47, in polished brass. The hydrangeas and the stone planters on either side were the same ones she had chosen herself 3 springs ago, now beginning to bloom in pale violet. The door was exactly as she had left it 14 days ago, but the lock was different. Not visibly, not obviously. You would have to be standing where she was standing, right there, at 6:47 in the morning, still wearing the same linen trousers she had slept in on the overnight flight from Lagos, to notice that the brass of the lock plate was very slightly brighter than the surrounding metal, newer, unweathered, recently installed. Adaeze Mercer stood on the step of her own home and understood, in the clearest, coldest, most wordless way a thing could be understood, what had been done. She did not knock. She did not call out. She did not press the bell, which she could hear chiming pleasantly somewhere deep inside the house, the same 3-note melody she had programmed herself when they moved in. She stood still. Behind her, the car she had taken from the airport idled softly at the curb, the driver uncertain whether to go. She had told him she would only be a moment. She had believed that when she said it. Her bag was still in her hand, a soft, worn leather holdall, the kind that had been packed and repacked so many times it seems know the shape of every departure. Inside it, 3 days' worth of clothes, a small notebook, its pages swollen with humidity, a paperback novel she had not opened, a hospital visitor badge, the peel-and-stick kind, still stuck to the side pocket, bearing her name printed in block letters above the words Palliative Care Family Visitor. And beneath the visitor badge, a folded order of service, white card printed in navy and gold, from the private chapel at Lagos International Hospital. Her grandfather had died 4 days ago. She had been holding his hand when it happened. She had watched the line on the monitor go flat with a quietness that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe. She had flown back to London the night before last, delayed by 12 hours, her eyes dry and her chest carrying the kind of heaviness that has no name in English, though her grandmother had a word for it in Igbo, a word that meant something like the weight a soul leaves behind when it goes. And she had come home, only to find that home, it seemed, was no longer available to her. She was still standing there when the door opened from the inside. It opened not cautiously, not with the hesitation of someone who has heard a noise and is afraid. It opened with the casual confidence of someone who lives there. A woman stepped into frame, tall, blonde, wearing what appeared to be a white silk robe that Ada recognized as her own. The woman blinked at the early morning light. She looked at Ada on the step with the mild, vague irritation of someone whose morning had been unexpectedly interrupted. Then she appeared to remember something, and her expression changed from mild irritation to careful blankness, the kind of blankness that is, itself, a very specific kind of cruelty. "You must be Ada," the woman said. Ada did not answer. She looked at this woman wearing her robe in her doorway. She looked at her with the same calm steadiness with which she had looked at the unturning key, and the newly installed lock plate, and the pale violet hydrangeas blooming faithfully in their stone planters. She took one slow breath through her nose, and then Adaeze Mercer did the thing that would define everything that followed. She said nothing. She picked up her bag, turned from the door, walked back to the waiting car, and got in. "Ma'am," the driver said. "Shall I?" "A hotel," she said quietly. "Wherever is closest." The car pulled away from the curb. Ada looked straight ahead to the windscreen as a familiar street fell behind her. The hydrangeas, the black door, the woman in the white robe. And she did not look back. Not once. But her hands, folded in her lap, were absolutely, utterly still. That stillness was not grief. It was not shock. It was the stillness of a woman who had just decided something. Her full name was Adaeze Chidinma Okafor Mercer. She had been born in Enugu, in the southeastern part of Nigeria, the eldest grandchild of Chief Emeka Okafor, a man who had, Over the course of 50 years, and through what most people in the industry called a combination of impossible genius and unshakable will, built one of the largest privately held maritime shipping companies in the world. Okafor Marine Holdings operated 47 cargo vessels across 3 oceans, maintained port facilities in Lagos, Mombasa, Rotterdam, and Houston, and moved an estimated $400 million in freight per month. Ada had grown up knowing none of this in any practical sense. She had grown up knowing her grandfather as a large, quiet man who smelled of pipe tobacco and engine oil, who rose before the sun and prayed an Igbo at the window before anyone else was awake, who kept a small framed photograph of a rusted fishing boat on the wall of his study. The first vessel he had ever owned, bought secondhand from a Dutchman in 1971 for money he had spent 3 years saving. She had grown up knowing him as the man who taught her to read balance sheets before she was 10, who told her that money was not the point, but that understanding was power, who said to her once, when she was 12 and crying over something she could no longer remember, "There is no dignity in letting the world decide who you are. That job belongs to you alone." She had taken that to heart, in her way. She had studied economics at the University of Lagos, then completed a master's degree at the London School of Economics, which was where she had met Richard Mercer. He was doing his MBA. He was charming in a way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, instinctively, without appearing to try. He had blue eyes and a clean jaw and the kind of easy confidence that comes from having always been told that the world was arranged for people like him. He had noticed Ada across a seminar room, and what he had seen, a quietly composed, exceptionally beautiful woman with a slight accent and measured opinions, had interested him in a way that things that seemed slightly exotic tend to interest men like Richard. They had married 3 years later. The wedding had been held in London, at a Mayfair hotel, with Richard's family filling most of the seats on one side, and a smaller, warmer, louder contingent of Okafors filling the other. Ada's grandfather had flown in from Lagos. He had sat in the front row and watched his granddaughter exchange vows with this Englishman, and his face had held an expression that Ada had not, at the time, thought too deeply about. Later, she would come to understand it as the expression of a man who is waiting to be proven wrong. He had never said a word against Richard, not once. That, she would later understand, was also information. The marriage had begun well enough. Richard was a senior associate at a private equity firm in the city. They had bought the house in Kensington. They had attended dinners and openings and the sorts of events where names and titles were exchanged with the smooth efficiency of currency. Ada had taken a role at a consultancy, mid-level, unremarkable, the kind of job that kept the mind busy without disturbing the domestic arrangements that Richard preferred. She had been good at it. She had been good at most things she applied herself to in the quiet, thorough way that people who are not trying to be seen tend to be good at things. But somewhere in the years that followed, she could never identify the exact moment, only the accumulation of moments. The texture of the marriage had changed. The way a fabric changes when it has been washed too many times. The same dimensions, the same shape, but something essential worn away. Richard had been promoted and promoted again, and with each promotion had come a slight but perceptible recalibration of who he understood himself to be in relation to the people around him. He had become a man who corrected other people's wine choices at dinner, a man who talked over his wife at parties, a man who introduced her, not infrequently, as my wife Ada. She works at a consultancy in a tone that made the consultancy sound like something one did while waiting for real life to begin. His family had never been warm to her. His mother, Patricia Mercer, was a woman of a particular English type, well-dressed, well-spoken, and absolutely certain, in a way she would never articulate plainly, that her son had married beneath himself. She was unfailingly polite to Ada at every family gathering, which was itself a form of distance. She called her dear and asked after her family in Africa with the careful curiosity of someone handling something foreign. She never asked about the shipping company. Most of the people in Ada's life in London never asked about the shipping company. They did not know there was a shipping company. Ada had never made a point of telling them, partly because it did not occur to her to lead with her grandfather's achievements, and partly because, in the world she had married into, it was tacitly understood that wealth was something to be inherited gracefully, not announced. And so Adaeze Mercer had moved through 11 years of marriage as a woman whom people consistently underestimated. whose quietness was read as passivity, whose measured speech was taken for slowness, who sat at tables and absorbed rooms and observed everything while appearing to observe nothing, and who, at the end of every evening, drove home beside her husband in a silence that had, over time, become something other than comfortable. She had known about the other woman for approximately 4 months before she flew to Lagos. She had not confronted Richard. She had watched and noted and placed each observation carefully in the part of herself that she had built, over the years, to hold things that were not yet ready to be acted on. There was a name, Camille. There was a flat in Fulham. There were evenings that ran late and mornings that smelled different, and the very particular way that a man stops fully looking at you when he is somewhere else, in his mind, to look. She had said nothing, not from weakness, from timing. Then the call had come from Lagos. Her grandfather was ill. Suddenly, severely, finally ill. She had packed her bag and gone. The weeks before Ada flew to Lagos had been an education in just how thoroughly invisible a person can become in their own life. She had told Richard about her grandfather's condition on a Tuesday evening in March, standing in the kitchen while he sat at the island scrolling through something on his phone. She had said the words, "Grandpa Emeka is very ill. The doctors say it could be weeks," and watched him look up at the expression he wore when interrupted from something more pressing. "You want to go, then," he had said. Not "I'm sorry," not "how serious is it," just a practical acknowledgement that a trip would be required. "Yes," she had said, "I'll book a flight for the end of the week." He had nodded and looked back at his phone. She had stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, her hands resting on the cool granite of the counter, and she had thought, not for the first time, about how a person's grief could exist in the same room as another person's indifference, and how that indifference was its own kind of violence. Quiet, deniable, precise. The days before she left were ordinary in the way that days before a threshold tend to be ordinary. Richard was in the office early and home late. He took 2 calls during dinner that he excused himself to take in the hallway, his voice dropping below the register she could hear from the table. She folded her clothes and placed them in the hold all. She watered the plants. She paid the standing orders that she managed, as she had always managed the household finances, without acknowledgement from anyone that the management was happening at all. At the firm Christmas party 6 weeks earlier, which she had attended as she always did, quiet and composed in a dark green dress, she had stood near the edge of a conversation between Richard and 3 of his colleagues, 2 of whom she had met at least a dozen times. She had listened to them discuss a deal in Johannesburg, and when she had offered a quiet observation about the port infrastructure in that region, drawing on knowledge she had absorbed over a lifetime of conversations with her grandfather, Richard had laughed gently, in that particular way. "Ada used to read economic reports for fun," he had said to the group, with the fond, slightly embarrassed tone of a man sharing an eccentric habit. "She knows all sorts of things." The group had laughed politely and moved on. She had held her glass and said nothing more, but she had noted it. She noted, too, the way Patricia Mercer had behaved at the family lunch in February, just weeks before the flight to Lagos. They had been discussing, of all things, the global freight markets. Richard's firm had taken a position in a logistics company, and there had been some question at the table about ocean freight rates and the disruptions in the Red Sea corridor. Ada had been listening from one end of the table, and she knew the answer. She knew the precise numbers. She had heard her grandfather discuss this over phone just a week before. She had started to speak. Patricia had spoken over her, not loudly, barely noticeably, but clearly. The older woman had simply continued a sentence, as though Ada's voice had not occurred, and the table had followed Patricia's thread, and the conversation had moved on, and Ada's words had simply not entered the world. Richard had not noticed, or had not chosen to. Ada had cut a piece of meat and chewed, and looked at the window, and somewhere in the center of herself she had felt something she could only describe as a tightening, the way a muscle responds before a long effort, the body preparing. There were smaller things, too, in those weeks. The way the housekeeper, a woman who had been quietly loyal to Ada for 3 years, had seemed slightly uncomfortable when Ada returned one afternoon to find Richard home unexpectedly. The way certain names in his phone had changed, contacts relabeled, calls cleared. The glass of water on what she now understood was not simply Richard's side of the bathroom, but on the mirror ledge on what had always been her side. She had gone to her grandfather's bedside and held his hand through nights when the pain was greatest. She had sat in the vinyl chair beside his hospital bed in Lagos and listened to him breathe, and when he was lucid, she had listened to him talk, quietly, unhurriedly, in the way that people talk when they are very near the end, and have finally let go of a need to perform anything. He had told her things she had not known, about his father, about the first decade of building the company, the debts and the near failures, and the 1 year when everything almost dissolved, about her grandmother, gone now 15 years. And on the last night before he lost consciousness for the final time, he had said something that she had carried out of the hospital and onto the plane and across the sky above Sahara and the Mediterranean, and she was still carrying it when she stood on the step of her own house in the morning light and found the lock changed. He had taken her hand and said, "In Igbo, I have given you something. It will be explained. You are ready for it. You are always the one I chose." She had not fully understood then what he meant. She would understand very soon. The hotel was near Paddington. Functional, anonymous, the kind of place that asks nothing of you and offers its own particular mercy in return. She paid for 3 nights with her card. She went upstairs. She set her bag on the luggage stand and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. She allowed herself 3 minutes. Not to cry. Ada had not cried since the chapel in Lagos, and something in her had decided, without formal deliberation, that she had finished crying for now. She allowed herself 3 minutes to simply sit in the full weight of what had happened. The lock, the woman in the robe itself that she recognized as the one she had bought on a trip to Positano 4 years ago, the trip that Richard had claimed to enjoy, the trip that she now understood was, like most things, differently remembered by each of them. Then she opened her phone and called Richard. He answered on the 4th ring. "Ada." His voice was calm, prepared. She had the impression that he had been waiting for this call with the calm of someone who has already choreographed their response. "The locks have been changed," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Ada, I think we're past the point when, she said, where pretending makes sense for either of us." "Richard, when did you change the locks?" A beat of silence. "A week ago." She had been in Lagos, sitting beside her grandfather's bed. He had changed the locks while she was in Lagos, sitting beside her grandfather's bed. "There will be papers sent to the hotel," he said. "I spoke with your lawyer. He doesn't know which hotel, but if you contact me with the address—" "You spoke with my lawyer." "His office. Just to establish the protocol." "You went to my lawyer's office." She was not asking. She was simply saying the words aloud, slowly, in a methodical way one examines objects to confirm they are real. "Ada," Richard said, and his voice carried in it something that might, in a different life, have passed for gentleness. "I think you know this has been over for a long time. I think you've known that. Camille and I don't want to discuss Camille," Ada said. "We're expecting—" She pressed end. She sat with the phone in her hand and breathed. The room was very quiet. The traffic outside was a low murmur, the way traffic always is in cities when you are standing at the edge of something that has changed your life. He had changed the locks while she was in Lagos. He had done it while she was sitting at the bedside of her dying grandfather, 9 hours away by plane, unable to come home even if she had known, because the man she had helped raise her was taking his last weeks, and she would not have left for anything. Richard had known this. He had chosen this window precisely. The careful, cowardly calculus of it was something she absorbed slowly, like ink spreading through water. The papers arrived by courier at 11 that morning. She signed for them without expression. She sat on the bed and read them. The divorce petition was orderly and precise, the language of lawyers draining all drama from what is, in fact, a deeply dramatic act. Irreconcilable differences. He was petitioning for the house, citing that his name was on the primary deed. He was offering a settlement that, by any reasonable standard, was an insult. A lump sum, a modest monthly amount, the contents of her personal wardrobe and her car. 11 years, a lump sum, and her wardrobe. She placed the papers on the bed beside her. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone again, not to call Richard, not to call anyone she knew, but to look at a number she had been given in Lagos, on the last morning before her grandfather lost consciousness, a number that had been pressed into her hand by a small, precise man in a dark suit who had introduced himself as Mr. Obi Nwachukwu, senior partner, Nwachukwu and Associates, Lagos, and who had said to her, very quietly, before she left the hospital corridor, "Please call us as soon as you arrive wherever you are going. There is a matter of great urgency regarding your grandfather's estate. It concerns you directly." She had tucked the card into the inner pocket of her bag, without asking questions. She looked at it now. She set the divorce papers to one side, and she called the number. The call lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, Adaeze Mercer sat on the edge of the hotel bed in Paddington for a long time without moving. The curtain moved once in a draft from the window she had left partially open. A bus passed below. Someone in the corridor outside knocked on a door and was let in. Ordinary sounds. The city go about itself, indifferent and continuous. She had been told the following, that her grandfather, Chief Emeka Okafor, had revised his will for the last time 13 months ago, 6 months after the death of his only son, Ada's uncle Chike, who had died in a car accident on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. That in this revision he had named Adaeze Chidinma Okafor Mercer as the sole primary beneficiary and controlling heir of the entirety of Okafor Marine Holdings, its port facilities, its subsidiary holdings, its investments, its fleet, and all associated trusts. That this inheritance, conservatively valued at the last formal audit, was $83 billion. That the formal reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks hence, in Lagos, and that by Nigerian inheritance law, her legal claim was already binding and had been logged with the relevant regulatory authorities. That Mr. Nwachukwu's firm had been instructed to ensure she was protected and informed at the earliest possible opportunity. That there were certain formalities, power of attorney documents, board notifications, a temporary trustee structure to be dismantled, that would require her attention in the coming days. That she would, once the formalities were complete, effectively control one of the largest privately held shipping companies on the African continent. That she was, in the precise legal and financial sense, one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. She had held the phone long after Mr. Nwachukwu had said goodbye. She had looked at the wall of the hotel room. She had thought of her grandfather's hands, large, brown, creased with work, wrapped around hers in that final wardroom. And she had thought of what he said. "I have given you something. You were always the one I chose." She did not call Richard. She did not call his mother. She did not call anyone at his firm. She did, quietly and deliberately, call 3 people. The first was a London solicitor she had been referred to by Mr. Nwachukwu, a woman named Dr. Yatun Fashola, who ran one of the most respected private legal practices in the city, and who, Ada would discover, had been quietly briefed on the inheritance situation 48 hours earlier, in preparation for precisely this moment. Dr. Fashola answered on the second ring. She had a low, measured voice and the quality of total, professional calm. When Ada told her about the divorce papers and the locked house and the lump sum settlement offer, there was a brief pause on the line. "Mrs. Mercer," Dr. Fashola said, "I want you to do one thing for me right now." "Yes." "Do not sign anything. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until we have spoken in person. Can you do that?" "Yes," Ada said. "Good. And one more thing. I'd like you to stop thinking of yourself as someone being offered settlement. From this moment, you are not that person." Ada looked at the divorce papers on the bed beside her. "I understand," she said. The second call was to her cousin Ifeoma, in Lagos, the one family member she trusted completely, the one who had been present at the hospital in those final days, and who knew everything and said little. She told Ifeoma only what was necessary. Ifeoma was quiet for a moment, and then said, in the way that Igbo women say certain things, "He changed the locks while you were at Grandpa's bedside?" There was a tone in it that carried, underneath the question, an entire world of judgment. "Then let him keep the locks. He won't like what you bring back through the door." The third call was to no one she knew personally. It was to a private hotel management company. She asked about extended residency suites. She provided a credit card. She moved that afternoon to a set of rooms in a Mayfair hotel that had, among its private services, a dedicated concierge, a secure conference facility, and a name known in certain circles as the address where important people stayed when they did not wish to be found. She unpacked her hold doll with the same unhurried care she brought to everything. She hung her clothes. She placed her grandfather's order of service on the nightstand. Face up, she ordered tea. She sat at the writing desk by the window and began to write a list, not of grievances, not what she had lost, but of what she needed to do, and in what order and at what pace. In the days that followed, she moved with a particular efficiency of someone who has finally understood what game is being played, and at what level they are actually qualified to play it. She met with Dr. Fashola in a glass-walled office overlooking the Thames. She sat across a wide table and listened to a 2-hour briefing delivered by 3 lawyers and a financial analyst from Mr. Nwachukwu's London liaison office. She asked precise questions. She took notes in her small, swollen notebook, in the tight, economical handwriting she had learned from her grandfather. She signed what needed to be signed and deferred what needed to be deferred. She called Lagos twice a day and was never once impatient with the pace of the formal proceedings. Meanwhile, Richard's lawyers had sent 2 follow-up communications pressing for a response to the settlement offer. Dr. Fashola had acknowledged receipt and indicated that her client required time to review. This was standard, routine, nothing to accelerate anyone's heart rate in the offices of Mercer and Associates. Richard himself had texted once, "Ada, it's better for everyone if we handle this cleanly. I think you know that." She had read it and put her phone face down on the desk. She did not respond. She had also, in those days, made certain phone calls to certain journalists she had met at LSE, people who moved in financial news circles. She did not say much during these calls. She asked about upcoming industry events. She mentioned, in passing, that she had some interesting news she might be ready to share in the next few weeks regarding the maritime sector. She mentioned no names, no numbers. She simply planted, with absolute restraint, the idea that something worth paying attention to was coming. She also called Richard's firm, not Richard himself, but his managing partner, a man named Gordon Clark whom she had met at their Christmas parties for a decade, and who had always spoken to her with the same pleasant blankness with which people speak to furniture they find inoffensive. She left a message saying she hoped to speak with Mr. Clark in the coming week regarding a matter of mutual professional interest. Just that, nothing more. She imagined him finding the message and being vaguely, pleasantly puzzled. She let him be puzzled. At the end of the first week, she flew back to Lagos. She attended the private reading of the will in Mr. Nwachukwu's conference room, surrounded by family members whose expressions ranged from genuine grief to carefully concealed calculation. She sat at the head of the table because Mr. Nwachukwu placed her there. When the document was read aloud and her name was spoken, sole controlling heir and primary beneficiary of Okafor Marine Holdings and all associated entities, the room held a specific quality of silence that Ada had never felt before. She met the eyes of 3 male cousins in turn, cousins who had long assumed that the mantle would fall to one of them, and she held each gaze for exactly long enough to be understood. Then she thanked Mr. Nwachukwu, shook hands with the room, and went home to the house in Enugu where she had grown up, the house her grandfather had built, and she walked out into the garden in the early evening and stood in the warm air and breathed. She thought of the door in Kensington, the brass lock plate, brighter than the surrounding metal, the woman in her robe. She thought, not yet, and then she flew back to London. It was Gordon Clark who made it easy for her. He had, in fact, returned her call with surprising urgency, which told her that Richard had, in the intervening days, mentioned to him something about the divorce, or perhaps about Ada's grandfather's death, in a way that had piqued Clark's interest. Financial men have a particular instinct to the smell of money. She had agreed to meet him for lunch. The restaurant was in Mayfair, half a mile from her hotel. It was a kind of place that had no menu visible from the street, where the tables were generously spaced and the light was warm, and the waitstaff moved with the choreographed discretion of people who understood that the conversations happening around them were not meant to leave the room. Clark had arrived before her, which told her he was anxious. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, silver-haired, permanently tanned from skiing holidays, with a benign self-regard as someone who has never had to revise their understanding of who holds power in a room. He stood when she arrived. He had not stood for her at the last 6 Christmas parties she had attended. She had worn, deliberately, a suit she had not worn before, dark navy, precisely cut, the kind of garment that exists at the intersection of grief and authority. No jewelry except her grandfather's watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that she had inherited informally years ago and never worn publicly until today. It sat on her wrist with the quiet gravity of an heirloom. She shook Clark's hand and sat. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I was very sorry to hear about your grandfather." "Thank you," she said. Your family is the Okafor family?" "Of Okafor Marine." "Yes," she said. She unfolded her napkin. "He founded the company in 1971. He ran it until last year, when his health began to decline." There was the faintest shift in Clark's posture, something recalibrating. "And the company has continued to operate?" "Fully," she said. "We have 47 vessels active across 3 ocean lanes. Our Q1 freight numbers this year are ahead of projection." The "we" was not accidental. Clark was very still for a moment. Then, "You're involved in company?" She looked at him with the measured patience of a teacher who has expected the slow student. "I am the company, Mr. Clark. As of 11 days ago, I am the sole controlling heir and executive authority of Okafor Marine Holdings. Our operations are valued, as of last quarter, at $83 billion. The silence that followed was complete. She watched it move across his face. The disbelief, the rapid, undignified recalculation, the realization of what it meant that he had stood opposite this woman at a dozen events and never once thought to ask her a single question of substance about her life. She let the silence last for several seconds. "I mention this," she continued, "because I understand that your firm has been in conversations with your associate, Richard Mercer, regarding a domestic matter. Specifically, I believe Richard has shared with your partners that we are pursuing a divorce." I wasn't aware of the details." "No," she said pleasantly. "I don't imagine you were. Fully. I wanted to clarify something before the formal proceedings create any misunderstanding. Any assumptions about what I might or might not be entitled to, based on how this marriage has been understood by the people around us, those assumptions will need to be significantly revised." She opened her bag and placed a single folder on the table. She did not open it. She simply set it there. "My solicitor's office will be in touch with your firm's legal team this week. But I thought it was important that we speak first, as people who have known each other for some time. I've always believed that clarity is a kindness." Clark looked at the folder and looked at her and said nothing. "Enjoy your lunch, Mr. Clark," she said, rising. "I'm afraid I have another meeting." She left him sitting there, the folder untouched on the white tablecloth. But the room that truly mattered was the one 3 days later. Dr. Fashola had requested a joint meeting between both legal teams, a standard preliminary step in divorce proceedings. Richard had arrived with 2 of the most senior divorce lawyers in the city, men who moved through proceedings like surgeons, precise, cold, and used to winning. He had dressed carefully. He had the slightly elevated color of a man who believes he holds the high ground. He sat across the conference table from Ada and looked at her with the expression she had seen directed at her for 11 years, the patient, gentle, slightly condescending tolerance of a man who knows he is in control. She was already seated when he arrived. She looked up when he entered and said nothing, which was the same as saying everything. His lawyers had been provided, 30 minutes earlier, with a preliminary financial disclosure package prepared by Mr. Nwachukwu's London office in coordination with Dr. Fashola. The package was approximately 90 pages. It included audited accounts, board resolutions, regulatory filings, asset valuations, and a letter of confirmation from the Registrar of the Nigerian Corporate Affairs Commission confirming Ada's legal standing as principal shareholder and executive controller of Okafor Marine Holdings. She watched the lead lawyer, a man named Hartley, whom she understood to be considered one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in England, open the package and begin to read. He stopped on the 3rd page. He read it again. Then he turned to his colleague and made a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite anything else. Richard was watching them. His confidence, which had been a physical thing in the room, had begun to lose its shape, the way a candle loses its shape just before it goes soft. "Mr. Hartley," Dr. Fashola said pleasantly, from Ada's side of the table, I trust the documentation is in order. Hartley looked up. He was professional enough to keep his face composed, but his eyes carried something new in them. The particular attentiveness of someone who has just understood that the landscape they were navigating is very different from what they mapped. "We will need time to review," he said. "Of course. There's no rush." Dr. Fashola folded her hands. "Though I would flag, in the interest of everyone's time, that page 47 details the prenuptial agreement, the one Mr. Mercer's team drafted and insisted upon at the time of marriage, and its applicability to assets acquired by inheritance. You'll find the relevant clause on page 48. I believe it was written with some care." Richard looked at his lawyer. Hartley turned to page 47. He was quiet for a very long moment. Ada looked at Richard then, for the first time since he had entered the room, not with anger, not with tears. She looked at him with the full, steady, unperformative gaze of a woman who has decided that her life begins again today, and who finds, in that decision, a stillness so complete it filled the room like weather. Richard opened his mouth. She spoke before he could, very quietly. "You changed the locks while I was holding my grandfather's hand," she said. The room went absolutely still. "I want you to understand," she continued, in the same measured tone, "that I am not here today because of the locks. I'm not here because of Camille or the robe or the settlement offer. I'm here because my grandfather spent 50 years building something and then placed it in my hands. And I will not allow anything, not this divorce, not this table, not any assumption any person in this room has ever made about who I am, to diminish what he gave me or what I intend to do with it." She looked, briefly, at the folder still open in Hartley's hands. "Tell your client what the numbers say," she said to him. "I'll be outside." She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the conference room with the same unhurried calm with which she had walked back to the car from the black door in Kensington. And she stepped into the corridor, and she stood at the window looking out over the city, and she breathed. She did not hear what was said inside the room after she left. She did not need to. The revised settlement proposal arrived 4 days later. It bore almost no resemblance to the first one. The figure had been corrected, massively, vertiginously corrected, in a way that told Ada everything she needed to know about how much Richard's lawyers now understood about who they were dealing with. Dr. Fashola reviewed it, made a set of counterproposals, and advised Ada that the legal process would take several months to complete. Ada acknowledged this and told her to proceed at whatever pace the law required. There was no urgency. There was no rush. She was not going anywhere. Richard had called twice in the week following the conference meeting. She had not answered. She had, through Dr. Fashola, communicated that all further contact was to go through legal counsel. This was standard. This was appropriate. And it also had the effect of making very clear to him, to the man who had changed the locks and sent a courier to a hotel and spent 11 years introducing her as my wife Ada. She works at a consultancy, that she was operating on her own terms now, in her own time, with her own representation, and that the informal power he had exercised over the cadence of their relationship was over. Word moved, as it always does in professional circles, faster than anyone plans. Gordon Clark had spoken to someone who had spoken to someone, and by the following week there were 2 emails in Ada's inbox from senior partners at firms she had never done business with, expressing admiration for her family's legacy and interest in discussing potential partnerships. She read them and filed them methodically in a folder labeled Future. She would return to them when the time was right. Not now. Patricia Mercer had called. This call Ada had taken. It had been brief. The older woman's voice had a new quality in it. Not warmth, exactly, because that would have required a fundamental change in who she was. And Ada did not expect that. But the brisk dismissiveness was gone. In its place was something more careful, something almost cautious. "Ada," she had said, "I hear you've been going through rather a lot." "Yes," Ada had said. A pause. "Your grandfather was clearly a remarkable man." "Yes," Ada said again. Another pause. Longer. "I hope," Patricia began, and then seemed to reconsider, and started again. "I hope this can all be handled properly." Ada understood what properly meant to this woman. It meant quietly. It meant in a way that did not embarrass. In a way that preserved the comfortable surface of things. Everything will be handled exactly as it should be, Ada said. I hope you're well, Patricia. And she ended the call with the same polite finality with which one closes a door on a room one has decided not to return to. In Lagos, the announcement of her formal assumption of the CEO role at Okafor Marine Holdings was covered by 4 major African business publications and picked up by 2 international trade press outlets. The headline in one read, "New Leadership at Okafor Marine. Meet the woman taking the helm of Africa's largest private shipping empire." There was a photograph, the one she had taken with Mr. Nwachukwu's team on the day of the board confirmation, standing at the head of the table in the same dark navy suit, her grandfather's watch on her wrist, her face carrying precisely the expression it needed to carry. She had approved the photograph herself. She had known exactly which one to choose. The office building was being prepared in Lagos. The London base would follow, a set of floors in a glass tower in Canary Wharf, already earmarked by the operational team, the kind of space that announced its occupant's seriousness before anyone had even entered. She would be splitting her time between 2 cities for the foreseeable future. She was, in the understanding of that fact, strangely at peace. The Kensington house went to Richard. She had agreed to this, not because she lost the argument, but because she chose not to make it. She had no need of the house. She had no need of its black door and its hydrangeas, and the carefully accumulated appointments of a life built around a man whose estimation of her had always been, she now understood, too small to live inside. She took her grandfather's watch. She took the books she had brought into the marriage. She took the photograph she had carried through 11 years on a bookshelf in the study. Herself at 14, sitting beside her grandfather on the deck of one of his first large freighters in the Lagos harbor, squinting into the sun, both of them laughing at something one of the crew had just said. She left everything else. She just left. Camille had apparently said to someone who had said it to someone who had said it to Ada's cousin Ifeoma, who had told Ada over phone. She didn't even fight for it. Ada had smiled when Ifeoma told her this. She had thought of the photograph, the deck of a freighter, the Lagos harbor, the sun. No, she thought, I didn't need to fight for it. I was already coming home. 6 months later, on a Thursday morning in September, Adaeze Chidinma Okafor stood on the deck of the MV Chief Emeka, a newly commissioned bulk carrier, the largest vessel in the Okafor Marine fleet, named by unanimous board vote for the man who had built it all from a second-hand fishing boat in 1971, and she watched the coast of Lagos grow smaller as the ship moved out into open water. The morning was clear, the kind of clear that happens in that particular latitude when the rains have just ended, and the air has been washed clean, and the light comes straight and gold across the water and makes everything look like the beginning of something. She had her grandfather's watch on her wrist. She had a cup of tea that was going cold in her hand because she kept forgetting to drink it. She had not thought about Richard in 2 days, which was progress, not because she was angry, but because she was simply no longer pointed in that direction. She thought about the lock. She thought about standing on that step in the early morning light, her travel bag in her hand, the visitor badge still on the pocket, and the key that would not turn. She thought about how she had gone still in that moment. Not frozen, not broken, but still in a way that a thing goes still when it has arrived at the point of decision. She thought about getting back in the car. She thought about the hotel room and the paper cup of tea and the divorce papers laid out on the bed and the card in the inner pocket of her bag with Mr. Nwachukwu's number on it. She thought about what would have happened if she had not been the kind of woman who gets back in the car. Dignity, her grandfather had told her once, is not something given to you. It is something you carry with you, and the carrying of it is what makes it real. People try to take it from you in many ways. Openly, loudly, sometimes, but more often quietly, incrementally, through 100 small dismissals that they expect you not to notice, or that they hope you are too diminished to respond to. The work is not to protect it. The work is to keep carrying it until the moment comes when the weight of it is visible to everyone in the room. She had carried it for 11 years. She had carried it through the Christmas parties and the family lunches and the dinners where she was talked over and the seminar rooms where her knowledge was laughed off as a charming eccentricity. She had carried it through the silences and the absences and the growing understanding that the man she had married had never fully seen her, had seen instead the parts of her he found useful or appealing and had taken those parts and arranged them to his liking and called that a marriage. She did not regret the years. That would be the wrong response. And she was not, at her core, a woman given the wrong responses. The years had made her patient. The years had made her precise. The years had made her, in some ways she could not fully articulate, readier for the morning on the step with a key that would not turn than she might otherwise have been. Suffering, if it does not diminish you, has a way of sharpening the instrument of yourself. She had not been diminished. She knew that now with the full, unperformable certainty of a fact. The ship moved steadily outward. The water was deep blue at the edge of the shallows, and then blue-black beyond, and the horizon was enormous and clear. And somewhere far ahead of them, days away, were the ports they were sailing toward, Rotterdam, and then Houston, and then back again, the great circular logic of ocean commerce that her grandfather had navigated for half a century, and that she would now navigate for whatever years were hers. She thought of him, the large, quiet man, the pipe tobacco, the photograph of the rusted fishing boat, the hospital room in the final hours, his voice coming from somewhere deep and slow. I have given you something. You were always the one I chose. She had not known what he was giving her then. She had thought it was only love, which would have been enough. But it was more than love. It was a fleet. It was a legacy. It was 47 ships moving across 3 oceans. It was the thing he had built with his father's name and his own hands, and 50 years of refusing to let the world decide who he was. He had held all of it for 50 years, and then he had placed it in her hands and said, "Yours." And here she was. The tea had gone entirely cold. She set it on the railing beside her. She looked at the horizon. She did not think about what came next, the board meeting in Rotterdam, the contract negotiations, the London office still being outfitted, the 1,000 practical demands of things she had inherited. There would be time for all of it. Time was, for the first time in a long time, something she had in abundance. She thought instead about a word her grandmother used to use, a word in Igbo that meant roughly, the quiet that comes after you have done something that was always yours to do. There was no good English translation. Certain languages have words for things that other languages have not yet found the need to name. She was in that quiet now, standing on the deck of a ship that bore her grandfather's name, her grandfather's watch on her wrist, the coast of Lagos behind her, and the open ocean ahead, and the sky above them both impartial and enormous and full of light. She had not won anything, she understood, in the way people use the word win, as though life is a contest between parties, and one loses so that the other may prevail. What had happened was simpler than that. What had happened was that she had remained herself through every attempt to make her smaller than she was, and in remaining herself she had arrived, finally, at the full dimension of who she was always going to be. That was not victory. That was arrival. She stood at the rail for a long time, the wind off the water pressing softly against her face, and she breathed the air that smelled of salt and distance in the great unhurried world, and she did not rush to be anywhere else. She was at last exactly where she was supposed to be, and it was enough. It was finally more than enough.